Lehre. Then with this we come, and sorry for mixing up the order a little bit here, Patrick Devine-Wright, who is also as the main job professor at Exeter University. Patrick, you are a professor there, but so on the one hand you are also doing research, and I think you've done this for many years now, research on community energy. But I know you told me that you're also personally involved in community energy, so you know the practical side as well, and you will tell us about the experience in the United Kingdom and in Ireland. Patrick.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and to Monica for organizing this and inviting me to be here today and speaking to you all. I'm going to try and share my screen, and it's just, here we go.
Coming, yes, looks good.
Okay, so as Stefan said, maybe following up from the last presentation by Lara, you're going to hear maybe a bit more of an academic insight rather than a practitioner insight, but I'd also like to wear two hats today, and the second hat is the fact that I've been involved in a local renewable energy cooperative near where I live for the last 5 years called Exeter Community Energy, and I will be sharing a few insights from that. I don't think I'm going to reach Ireland today. I think that's going to be beyond the scope of what I was able to put together, but I will talk a little bit about the UK policy context and how it might relate to other things happening on a more European-wide level in a more recent period. So just to introduce myself, on the left-hand side, I guess the academic hat. I've been interested in and involved in researching community energy, community power issues for quite a few years now. And I'm also currently involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the Working Group 3 on Climate Change Mitigation. And I just want to signpost here that community energy is a topic that will be reflected in that report that we're currently working on as part of the 6th assessment round. I'm also involved in various local and research initiatives around net zero and carbon emissions reductions, and research taking place on smart energy projects. And I've been involved for quite some time looking at community aspects of energy transitions. And that, of course, on a positive sense, that's about community power and community-led initiatives. But in a less positive sense, it's also been a lot around the so-called NIMBY problem and community objections and attempts to stop renewable energy projects going ahead. About 5 years ago, I got involved in a local community energy initiative called Exeter Community Energy, and that was out of, I think, an interest in maybe extending my personal involvement in the energy transitions beyond the theoretical domain or the academic domain. And so I've been a board member of Exeter Community Energy since then, and I was actually chair for a year in 2018. We're a relatively small organization, but we have managed to successfully develop solar PV projects on multiple rooftop sites across the city, all of which are owned by local people, local residents. And we also run a very large program to tackle energy vulnerability and fuel poverty issues, which are severe in some parts of the area that I live in. My own personal responsibility is for organizing and dispersing what we call an annual community fund. And that reflects our organizational commitment to spread the benefit of renewable energy community initiatives as widely as possible. Not everybody might be interested in becoming a member or purchasing shares, but the community fund is one way of taking some of the annual profit and distributing around the community, and also doing it in a participatory manner that accords with our values. So I think I'm going to talk about several things over the next few minutes, but obviously one of the things that we were asked to think about today was, why is this a good moment for community power? Is it a good moment for community power? And I would say that it certainly can be. Multiple crises are taking place at the moment. Many municipalities across the United Kingdom have declared a climate emergency in the past 12 months. And there's been an increasingly strong sense across society and resulting from various social movements that things need to change, and not just in an incremental way. And we kind of continue to follow kind of business as usual approaches. But for me, the critical thing here is what role do we think civil society has to play, communities play, or citizens play in this process of transformative change? And what I've certainly seen, and I think other people have noticed as well, is that it largely depends on whether you adopt a deficit model approach to the public and to their capabilities to meaningfully contribute and be active actors in transformation. And I think sometimes that's lacking in leaders and in policymakers who take more of a paternalistic approach and don't want to unduly worry or burden people, which isn't always the wisest approach, I think. I want to talk about the important role of trust today, which is, I think, something that is very relevant for community-led initiatives, and also maybe about different ways of doing economics and different ways of doing politics, complementing conventional democratic processes with opportunities to bring citizens into policymaking and decision-making, for example, through the use of citizens' assemblies that are increasingly being used in the UK to deal with the problem of the climate emergency and the difficulties that conventional politics has in making very difficult decisions, which are often not in the short-term interest of policymakers. The next slide is about community power. And I guess we've already had very useful definitions from the start from Stefan and also from Dirk from ResCube. So in a way, this slide is very similar to that. And it stems from a journal paper that I wrote with Gordon Walker back in 2008, which tried to make sense of the emerging idea of community energy at that stage, and saying that it was something to do with these two dimensions. And the vertical dimension here is called process, and it is a spectrum or a dimension from very open and local and participatory ways of doing energy projects to more closed or distant or institutional ways of doing it. And then the horizontal axis reflects where outcomes are distributed to, in particular positive outcomes, and whether they're distributed locally and collectively or more distantly. And we put forward this as one way of thinking about issues of local benefit distribution and local participation and ownership, and assuming that in the top right quadrant you would tend to have community-led energy initiatives, and by contrast in the bottom left quadrant you would tend to have the more conventional large-scale company-driven wind farm kind of approach. But of course that's a generalization, and the details of these boxes reflect different case studies of community energy initiatives that we studied in a research program, and reflecting that actually every single community initiative is quite diverse and different, and they can be positioned on these two axes in different places, and even they might change over time depending on how these particular initiatives evolve and change in their dynamics. So it's a slightly tricky thing to pin down, but at the same time there is this consistent emphasis, which I've mentioned and which Stefan has mentioned and others have mentioned today, that community energy is different from normal energy actions in being inclusive, in being locally driven, in being participatory, and in this emphasis that those who benefit should be local people, and it should be a collective benefit distribution. Now, if we think about all of this in terms of what are the benefits of this kind of approach to doing energy work and to doing renewable energy activities, for example, then I think that there are some things which the academic literature and the practice experience would tend to support. So we know that there's a trust problem out there in society, that policymakers tend not to be very much trusted, and energy utilities tend to be pretty low down the rankings as well. And I think that's something that community power can be held up as a potential contrast to. Bottom-up grassroots initiatives can empower local people to achieve change, and to achieve change that tangibly benefits people living nearby. The kind of energy proposals that come from community-led projects, I think, are more likely to be accepted because they tend to arise from and to be connected to the characteristics of the places that they are proposed for. And you don't always necessarily get that with company-led large-scale projects that are less founded upon a demonstrable local need. And they can be then perceived to be imposed to some degree top-down on local residents from the outside or from external actors. And then there's an economic argument here, which talks about the retention inside the local economy or local area of flows of finance, flows of knowledge, flows of benefit, rather than the flow moving outside to distant places and distant shareholders and distant people. And then I think there's a bigger picture here to community power, which isn't just about a specific project or a specific initiative. And that's this really urgent problem we now face to have extensive mitigation and development of renewable energy. And alongside that, there are a whole range of things that community energy initiatives can try and enable. For example, increases in energy literacy, positive attitudes to new technologies, new energy technologies, and new kinds of ways of thinking about energy, for example, to do with flexibility, the empowerment and active participation of people who have not tended to participate in energy activities in the past. And I think something which is really important that we haven't mentioned today, which is difficult conversations to be had about consumption levels, particularly in industrialized countries. There is a need to reconsider levels of resource use and consumption by people in developed economies if we are going to seriously address the climate emergency agenda, rather than assuming that we can keep consuming our way out of this problem and all we need to do is to reshape the supply side of the system and everything will be fine. But I think from an academic point of view, it's also important to stress that community power isn't some kind of ideal wonderland, and that there are some issues and difficulties that need to be faced and some challenges. The research literature shows that there is sometimes a lack of hard evidence about some of the positive impacts which the advocates of community power often mention. And there is some evidence about a lack of impact sometimes, that community energy initiatives don't always succeed, they don't always achieve what they want to achieve, and therefore they're no easy solution or panacea to rechanging and transforming energy systems. Whilst there's a lot of public support for community-led energy initiatives, the research suggests that most people don't actually want to become very actively involved in doing them. And that's because they take considerable amounts of time and effort, and many people are not able or willing to introduce that kind of commitment. And now that means that community power initiatives tend to be reliant upon a relatively small number of volunteers who have both the time and the skills available in order to be able to contribute to these initiatives. And I know from my own personal experience, in a way that I'd never appreciated before, that you really need a very good wide portfolio of skills available to a specific initiative. And I think my social science expertise, I would put some way behind legal, financial, commercial, technical skills, without which it's very, very, very difficult indeed to develop a community power initiative. Now, this raises questions about where these kind of individuals come from and how they can have the time to contribute, because community power is largely a voluntary activity, certainly in the UK. It's not necessarily professionalized, although it may move that way. And it raises an issue about distribution across communities, because we certainly don't want to have a situation where an emphasis upon community power actually ends up reducing a sense of equity or justice in energy transitions, because only some communities have the kind of capital, human capital, social capital, political capital, financial capital, to be able to undertake what might be quite innovative or risky technology projects. And what that suggests is that if we really want to have community power everywhere, then we need systemic intervention by policymakers, rather than just sitting back for some people to take action, but actually to enable that to happen. So community power is something that's very useful, it's very beneficial, but it's not necessarily very easy to pull off. And so the context for it, it's very reliant upon a favorable context, as some of the speakers have already mentioned, particularly around national policy systems. But there's more to it than that. In industrialized countries, the energy system we have, which has been developed over the last 50 to 100 years, is highly centralized. It is composed of incumbent companies who have an interest in preserving the status quo. Regulations often prohibit local energy buying and selling, and the ease of access to new entrants. And from a more social science point of view, the expectations about action has been conditioned by decades of relatively passive position being given to individuals and households and communities, which isn't easy to change overnight. And community power, and I would say maybe less so prosumers, are to some extent at odds with more neoliberal perspectives on society, which really just sees people as a collection of society as an aggregation of individual consumers who just need to purchase the right products, and then we will get the kind of transitions that we need. Now, what I'm going to just spend a minute or two very briefly on here is just telling a little story about the way in which community energy policy has evolved over the last 5 years in the United Kingdom, because I think it has a broader lesson for everybody who might be interested. And I was very excited, many others were, in 2014-15, when there was a very strong signal from a coalition government about a new emphasis and support for community energy, with a new policy, new structures, new support mechanisms, and it all seems to be in a very positive position to move forward. But then there was a change of government and the coalition was not there anymore, and the new Conservative Party-led administration really very quietly abandoned many of those ideas and innovations that were introduced in the previous few years. The Department of Energy and Climate Change was closed down, and energy was moved elsewhere into a portfolio of a department which was focusing on business essentially and industry. And note that we have a ministry for housing, communities and local government, but it was not seen as an appropriate place for energy to be put. And I think that sends quite a clear message that the current policymakers see energy as primarily an industrial issue, something to do with clean growth and innovation and private sector-led technological innovation, rather than necessarily something that communities play a very leading role in being involved in. I'm not going to talk through this table, it's a bit too complicated. And anyway, I can supply anybody who wants to read it with the journal paper that it is situated within. But just largely to say that the approach which is currently in place in the UK favours what is described as local energy solutions. And they're more to do with institutions and partnerships with a strong private sector-led element to them, rather than local citizens coming together to try and forge collective actions in the manner that we've described over the last few slides. So there's an emphasis upon smart technologies, upon technological innovation, upon clean growth, upon profit maximization, and attempting to patent new kind of technologies and services, which is quite a different approach to the community energy approach that had been there before. So just to kind of take my story to a conclusion, I think I would agree that community power has a very strong role to play in energy transitions in these times of multiple crises and emergencies. What we're seeing, I think, is a relocalization of lifestyles in a condition where mobility has effectively been curtailed drastically in a way that nobody could have expected or imagined six months ago. And I think that relocalization of services and lifestyles, indeed, could further bolster the support for a more local or community developed approach to energy initiatives and transformations. Trust, local embedding of ideas and practices, the sharing of benefit amongst different local people, and active participation, these are key elements of community power and of just transitions, which is a very important idea about how to conduct energy transitions in a fair way. But I think we still need better evidence of the positive outcomes of community power projects. And I think we need systemic intervention by policymakers at the national level and other levels to enable community power to flourish in every community. It's good to see new initiatives at the EU level, as Dirk from ResCoop mentioned already, the renewable energy cooperatives and citizen energy communities. It is very good to see that. But I think the UK experience shows that policy can ebb and flow in support for community power, and it's wise to retain an awareness of that potential fragility of policy support over time when looking at any new initiatives and giving them as much support as possible. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I think that's really obvious. You have spent a lot of time doing the practical research, and I really do appreciate that you share your conclusions also of your research with us. One thing I noted down is that you see two forms of crisis response. One is paternalistic. That's also what I bear in mind often these days, and the other one is the one based on trust, and trust is something that is in particular characteristic for community powers. I think that is a good approach, and also indicating that we have a choice between the